ten, 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 peace, 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 peace. Attempt. Dua attempt.
Puja, greetings. So we'll continue with the discourse of Ab Amon to Porphyry, and we'll just pick up where we left off last time. We'll go back a sentence or two and then move forward from there. And farther still, we preserve in the soul collectively the mystic and arcane image of the gods and goddesses. And through this, we elevate the soul to the gods and goddesses. And when elevated, conjoin it as much as possible with them. So we discussed this issue the last time of this spiritual evolutionary process of self-discovery. Actually, the mystic discovery of oneself as one of the Neteru, one of the gods and goddesses. And it's a mystic Simatali yoga process that takes place internally through certain metaphysical exercises and mystical realizations. So if you negate or you try to negate, because you can't really negate the existence of the soul. You can, from a deluded perspective, intellectual, but from a metaphysical reality, you can't negate it. And how certain subtle aspects of the personality, such as the soul, is discovered and verified is that you go through certain meditative practices and you experience your soul essence. And that's how you know. And how that is done is that the sages and the spiritual teachers, they give you the lessons and the techniques, the philosophy of how to accomplish such things. So Porphyry continues and he asks, he interjects a question. He says, why of significant names we prefer such as are barbaric to our own? And okay, so I'll let Ab Amon answer and explain what it means by barbaric to our own. Of this also, there is a mystic reason. For because the gods have shown that the whole dialect of sacred nations, such as those of the Egyptians and the Assyrians, is adapted to sacred concerns. On this account, we ought to think it necessary that our conference with gods and goddesses should be in a language allied to them. So we're going to stop here because it's a very important metaphysical point that Ab Amon is making. So if you notice, the names of the divinities are very short. So you have Ptah, Set, Sekhmet, etc. but the names of the personalities can be very long. Bersama Atra, Septepenra, Amunra Meses, et Anu. So that's what it means, that the names of the divinities seem to be very, very short as compared to the names of the personalities, the people. And he says that there's a mystic reason behind that, and that's a very important point. That the reason for the names of the gods and goddesses has a super mundane reason behind it. Again, the names are not just random applications or coming out of the imagination of people, or just creating stuff out of nothing. By mystic, it means that there is a process that is beyond the normal cognitive activity of the mind. Therefore, the names of the divinity are derived from a mystic process, something that transcends normal human reason. And he says here, the gods and goddesses have shown that the whole dialect of sacred nations, such as the Egyptians, adapted to sacred concerns. And what he means here is that the sacred nations of the divinities are their retinue. For example, Ptah Sekhmet Nefertim, Asar Set and Heru, Amun, Ra, Mut, and Khonsu. And each of the divinities have their own sacred cities. It's like a nation in and of itself. Because each of the Trinity system explain creation through the divinities of that Trinity. So for example, Ptah Sekhmet Nefertem explains the process of creation through Ptah Sekhmet Nefertem process. But if you explain the emergence of creation, you must of necessity also explain the dissolution of creation. And creation is dissolved to our perception through our mystic process. So therefore, the system of the gods and goddesses is also a mystic system that leads to the realization of the nature of creation beyond its appearance. So if creation emerges, then how does creation dissolve? How do we make creation dissolve? Because as long as there are appearances, there are illusions. So within the gods and goddesses system, there is the pathway principle of how to eliminate the illusion of the appearance of creation. So how to bring the nation to a dissolution. And when a nation comes to a dissolution, it means that you have discovered something that's transcendent of the nation. That's what he means by sacred concerns. A priest or priestess has mundane concerns, such as, having to go to the bank, pay bills, pay your mortgage, etc. But those are mundane concerns. What they're truly are absorbed in is the sacred concerns. And the sacred concern is the process of spiritual evolution that leads to the profound realization of the nature of things and events. In other words, the sacred concern is to the discovery of the truth of the divine within oneself. He said, on this account, we ought to think it necessary that our conference with the gods and goddesses should be in a language allied to them. So, in other words, there is a mystic communication between the personality and the gods and goddesses. And one way, which is the most palatable way to the senses, to create a communication with the divinities is through the act of giving offerings. But that's an act that's palatable to the senses. What Ab Amon is really referring to is the mystic communication that goes beyond the outward flowing senses of a human being. In other words, the communication in the mind. And therefore, the names of the gods and goddesses is a mystic language that the gods and goddesses can relate to. So the gods and goddesses uh, don't relate to things, or they don't associate with things of the mundane world, except in rare instances where they may act to affect uh, worldly events for spiritual reasons that have to do with the karmic basis of the universe, the people that are involved in a certain event. But generally speaking, the gods and goddesses refrain from mundane concerns. So you have to speak in their language, you have to speak in a spiritual language. So you can, yeah, so you see this in sports events, let's say baseball. The batter is up there and he's doing the sign of the cross and he's praying to God that he gets a hit. And then the pitcher is on the mound and he's praying to God that he throws a strike. And God doesn't care either way. Doesn't care about these mundane things. But people try to impress that upon God, but God doesn't care if you get a hit or you make a run or you score a touchdown, or God doesn't care. The Neteru don't care about those things. But if you were to turn your mind towards the Neteru in a process of spiritual evolution, then, and through the proper act of offering and surrender and humility, then the gods and goddesses will act in your favor to produce the proper conditions for you to grow spiritually in a way that leads to eventual enlightenment. So if you want to affect the world in some way, that's on you. You have to do those things. You have to act. Like you can't go sit in a classroom wanting to pass a test and don't study, and then pray to God that you're going to pass the test. It's not going to happen. You have to do the work. You have to study. And that goes for all human endeavors. Now, if your mundane endeavors, let's say like building a temple, is in service of the divine, then you can receive some metaphysical assistance uh, on the physical plane through certain processes. But the point is that you have to communicate to the divinities in a language that they understand. And it's not so much a language of speech, although there is part of that, like chanting the name of the gods and goddesses. You're speaking in their language. You're talking in a mode that they can relate to. Because likewise, such a mode of speech is the first and most ancient. And that's relating to when it means most ancient, you're not talking about ancient from the perspective of uh, humanity, like the most ancient civilization. He's talking about the most ancient meaning that which is derived from spirit. So think about it. Let's say you can trace your DNA to the uh, the African lady that is the ancestor of all humanity. Let's say you can do that. Well, where did she come from? The idea is that your true ancestors are the gods and goddesses, and your original ancestor is a spirit. And therefore, if you trace your true ancestry through your own inner divine nature, through the Neteru, the gods and goddesses, you would arrive at spirit. You would arrive at creator spirit consciousness. And then if you continue, you arrive at transcendental nature, which is Nebuchadnezzar. So it's a refutation of the world of time and space being an absolute reality. And the problem with to say modern modes of religion is mystical religion is a specific kind of science. And if the science is off, the results are going to be off. So to think someone is going to touch you on the top of your head and you're going to be liberated, or you're going to, uh, you know, in exuberant dance and yelling out, and that the science is off. There is something about you that is as the same self nature as the Neteru, and that is the soul. So the first order of business is discovery of soul within oneself. But you have to be led there. You have to. It's not a process that you can do on your own. Someone has to show you the way. Someone has to give you the text to study. Someone have to give you the process of how to do it. And when you discover the soul essence, then you discover that you are essentially one with those gods and goddesses. So you are one of the Neter. That kind of self-discovery negates the idea that your physical nature is an absolute reality. And, and in actuality, you are a spirit being. Your physical nature is a tool for the soul to explore the world. But there's a problem with that. And the problem is that it leads to untold misery, pain, and suffering. Even rich people suffer. To think of the richest person you can think of right now, has the most money, whatever, and that person suffers. As long as the personality is looking into the world for pleasure, for satisfaction, for contentment that never comes, that person is suffering. And it could be anybody. It could be could be a pope. It could be a minister. It could be a doctor. It could be president of a nation. It could be an emperor. If the personality is not drawing inwards into the nature of soul, then all that remains is a life basically of turmoil, suffering, and periods of pleasure and elation, but they're short-lived. You have to go back to you revert back to the default, which is anxiety, depression, irritability, uncertainty, and the sufferings that comes with lack of knowledge of self. So these are great implications that are coming through, and we'll pick up again next time as we continue this discourse. So dua everyone, until we meet again. Hetep.